For those of you who I don't know, my name is Raul Carrillo, and I'm the Deputy Director of the LPE Project. It is my privilege and pleasure to moderate today's event, which, as the title suggests, will situate the recent attacks on critical race theory, CRT, within a broader struggle for power over public education in the service of social hierarchies and economic inequalities. We've already shared quite a bit about our panelists, so please indulge my brevity with respect to introductions. They'll each be giving a 10-minute presentation, then we'll move on to crosstalk and audience Q&A per the usual format. So our panelists, Dr. Aziz Rana is the Richard and Lois Clark Professor of Law at Cornell. His research and teaching center on American constitutional law and political development, including shifting notions of race and citizenship. Dr. Latoya Baldwin Clark is an assistant professor of law at UCLA. She writes and teaches about education law, family law, property law, and race and discrimination, and also has a criminology background. Dr. Nikhil Singh is professor of social and cultural analysis and history at NYU and founding faculty director of the NYU Prison Education Program. He is an historian of race, empire, and culture in the 20th century United States. Diana Reddy is a doctoral fellow at the Law, Economics, and Politics Center at UC Berkeley Law, as well as a PhD candidate in UCB's Jurisprudence and Social Policy program, where her research includes the intersections of work law and movement law. Diana was previously a labor attorney and in-house counsel for the California Teachers Association. With introductions done, we'll go ahead and start with Dr. Rana. Thank you.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much to Raul and to Corinne for organizing this, and to all the other organizers. It's a pleasure to be part of the panel and really looking forward to the conversation. To date, a lot of the discussion about the anti-CRT bills and efforts has really focused on our particular political moment. So the way in which this is part of a specific white reaction against racial justice movements. And then also, clarifying exactly what critical race theory is. And I think, both of those responses are really important. And, I think rightly should take up a lot of our conversation and discussion. But what I'd like to do for my 10 minutes is really just take a step back and highlight how what we're witnessing right now is just the latest iteration of a long-standing white reactionary political practice that goes back really over a century. And I want to do that by highlighting two different elements of the contemporary politics. So first is the conservative argument about American identity, and second is the focus on schools. So let me just start with a conservative argument about American identity. I'm going to do this by reading a little bit from the recent Texas anti-CRT bill. And so thanks to Joey Fishkin, who sent me this because he thought I'd find it particularly interesting. So it includes this provision. It bans or it limits teachers, administrators from teaching with respect to the relationship to American values that slavery and racism are anything other than deviations from, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States, which include liberty and equality. Now, I think if you're a left of center person, there can be something really disorienting and strange about this phrasing. So for example, Nikhil on our panel has done a lot of work on the idea of American universalism. So this notion that the US from the founding has been committed to principles of liberty and equality, and ideas of American universalism or of the American creed really central to civil rights movement discourse. It's a common way that we think of promoting racial reform politics. But I think it's also really important to highlight the malleability and flexibility of American universalist arguments. And actually the fact that if we look at sort of the spread of a particular brand of white reaction over the course of the 20th century, in many ways, invoking universalism becomes really the dominant language of white racial reaction, and even more specifically, a very powerful strain of white supremacy. So it emerges in the North and the West, and then especially after the collapse of Southern segregationism, let's say in the 50s and 60s, that it spreads generally as a fairly comprehensive way of talking about white racial reaction. So where does this come from? Why is it so powerful? It really reaches a mass base in the years around World War I and right after World War I for a variety of reasons. We don't necessarily have to go into it. I don't have to go into it now, but if folks want to ask about it in Q&A, I can talk a little bit about the historical genesis. And it becomes very associated in its initial version with Woodrow Wilson. but is a powerful way of talking about racial reaction, especially in the North and the West. In part because it draws on Republican anti-slavery claims go all the way back to the Civil War. So what's the argument? The argument is that the US is the place where the Enlightenment came down to earth, and that for this reason, it is home to a set of institutions that are absolutely committed to universal equality. But, and here's the key but, that there is a reason why the Enlightenment came down to earth in the US, and that has to do with the cultural specificity and exceptionalism of the particular individuals that settled North America, in other words, of Anglo-European settlers. And that in this way, the Declaration of Independence, 1776, or the American Constitution in 1787, does not come just out of nowhere, but is actually the product of an entire 150-year history of cultural development and settlement that goes all the way back to, Puritans at Plymouth Rock, to the Mayflower Compact in the 1640s. And this becomes a really powerful language for articulating a rising brand of nativism and white racist politics. And the reason why is because it's a way of highlighting the perceived threats posed by new immigrant communities that might come with their own socialist ideals, that are participating in various forms of labor politics and labor struggle in the teens and the 20s, and even of the kind of threats posed by Black people as part of the Great Migration that are coming from the South to northern cities. And it ends up promoting a policy at the national level that's built around, well, maybe there needs to be pretty significant limits on entrance from communities from overseas that don't have the same cultural maturity as native-born white Americans, and white itself is a contested term during this period. And at the same time, it says that, well, even if, let's say, you can't stop folks that are already here from being present in the country, it requires a really intense project of Americanization, so that quote unquote culturally immature communities can actually sort of be inculcated with American values and a sense of American commitments, because you can only truly be invested in the principles of universalism if you have the same basic kind of cultural heritage as those that are already here. So that there's a way of combining universalism and ethno-racial identity. And it focuses then on how you read that history from 1619 or 1620 to 1776, 1787. Because the thought is that it's really significant to read that history as a history in the acculturation of basic principles of freedom and equality, rather than as a history effectively of dispossession or of violence, which, as part of socialist politics and radical politics during the early part of the 20th century was quite present as a way of telling a story instead of slaveholding, of class rule, and of indigenous dispossession. And all of this ends up playing out in the context of public schools. And so let me now turn to why this very specific and powerful language of universalism, that is a language of white reaction, ends up being articulated through the schools. So if you look at mass schooling in the US, this is really something that explodes in the early part of the 20th century. So in 1900, you have 34 states, 30 in the North and West, only 4 in the South. So it also highlights the ways in which what we're initially talking about is a politics of white reaction outside of the Jim Crow South. Have compulsory education laws. That becomes universal by the time we get to the 1930s. And universal education, including public schooling, is viewed as a centerpiece of progressive era reform efforts. And it mirrors the profound conflicts over ethno-racial identity that's sort of produced by immigration, by Black migration north, and also profound conflicts over labor, over the status of the labor movement, over questions of socialism and labor change that are taking place during this period. And it becomes a rallying cry for a variety of different, let's say, conservative political forces. So you have nativism, you have the business right, you have in the context of World War I, the military right, so groups like the American Legion or the Grand Army of the Republic. You have the Klan, and I want to get back to the Klan in just a bit, where they see concerns over indoctrination in schools as a significant place where the kind of social conflicts writ large are actually playing out at a local level. And what you end up having is the proliferation throughout the 19-teens, 20s, leading up to the early 1930s, of a variety of different bills. And so there's, let's say, a set of bills that we can think of both at the state level and at the national level that go together. Two of these are really about schooling and school instruction. So the first are bills around mandatory instruction in the Constitution. So in 1923, 23 states have bills requiring mandatory instruction in the Constitution. By the time we get to 1931, that number has gone up to 43. And the content of these bills, they might not be identical to what I just read in the Texas bill, but they certainly rhyme. So they include language that says, you know, it's central to have patriotic education. So patriotic education and citizenship is the purpose of these mandatory constitutional instruction bills. Samuel Weaver, who's one of the people that writes the bill in the state of Washington, again, talking about the West rather than the South, highlights that what's significant about these bills is that there should be a, quote, uniformity of instruction. What you don't want, for example, are to have socialist or progressive teachers at the local level educating people in a kind of critical evaluation of the Constitution or of the principles of 1776 to the extent to which they're actually real. Instead, what you're supposed to be inculcating is a sense of loyalty to the established institutions and to the clear markers of national identity. So that's one set of bills. A second set of bills that's directly connected to these are English-only instruction bills. And so these also explode in the teens and the 20s, so that in 1900, the end of the 19th century, only 9 states actually require mandatory English-only instruction. That goes up to 35 by the time we get to 1923. That's a significant piece of the policymaking agenda. And then at the national level, it goes hand in hand with the national origins quota. And the national origins quota is a dramatic attack on sort of migration of people from Southern and Eastern Europe, and then also from Asia and Africa. So it bans entirely migration from Asia and Africa in 1924 into the United States. It dramatically constricts migration from Southern and Eastern Europe. It means that after the bill goes into effect, essentially 84% of the people that come into the US are from Northern and Western Europe. And the percentage of foreign-born people in the US declines over the course of the mid-20th century from about 10 to 15% to just 5%. All 3 of these initiatives are strongly backed by the Klan. And this is where I want to bring in the second Ku Klux Klan, which is really a significant product of the North and the West during the 1920s. And at the state level, the Klan's primary policymaking agenda are these education bills that are supposed to transform the nature of education in the US. So constitutional instruction, English-only instruction are at the heart of what they're pursuing. And let's think a little bit about why it is that school instruction becomes such a galvanizing site of white supremacist, and then more broadly, let's say, white reactionary politics. And we can think a little bit about this with respect to the alliances made between groups like the Klan and groups like the business right. For the business right, there's a really immediate power to talking about indoctrination in schools. It's a lot more immediate than, for example, having, sort of abstract conversations about labor rights generally and the nature of regulation in the economy. Here you can say that there's a creeping socialism that has a direct effect on the capacity of families to be able to control the terms of instruction of their own children. And that goes hand in hand with the argument that the Klan is making. Just like the business right, during this period, these state bills are a way of tapping into a much broader mass constituency, because groups like the Klan and other nativist organizations can say, rather than thinking in the abstract, we can think of a kind of threat to a very specific Anglo-European American cultural identity that's tied to these principles, the basic bedrock principles, that is under attack. And one of the ways that it's under attack is by effectively having children through schooling, which is itself a kind of socialistic enterprise, turned against the parents. And in doing so, essentially breaking the basic terms of what had been traditionalist American society. And the thing that's noteworthy about this initial effort in the 20s and 30s is the way in which it reappears every single time there's a major kind of flashpoint around cultural and national identity in the US, tied or sometimes not necessarily tied to the politics of political economy and labor, over a preceding century, you see the same return to the question of indoctrination in schools and the need to reassert this particular combination of cultural particularity and exceptionalism and American universalism. And in fact, it is so profoundly grounded in what amounts to conservative and reactionary white politics in the US, that it's not even necessarily the case that people today are consciously thinking, oh, we're doing the same thing that we did 100 years ago, because it is just a naturalized part of the policymaking toolkit. And so it means that at present, it's actually really important, and this is just where I'll end. It's important to recognize both the long history, to make sense of why it has been so galvanizing as a mode of what amounts to political consciousness raising and movement organizing for the right, and how it can actually be practically disrupted in the present. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rana. Just that history is helpful for building the rest of this session. Folks, you can offer comments or questions in the Q&A chat function, just a reminder. Now on to Dr. Baldwin-Clark.
Thank you so much for having me. That was really fascinating. And I think what I'm going to say kind of really nicely piggybacks on what Professor Rana just said. So in my time, just my brief remarks, I want to focus on the anti-CRT movement and especially its relationship to contemporary schooling and the institutionalization of property in education policy. So as many of you know, after then President Trump's September 2020 executive order, conservatives around the country took on the president's call to excise discussions of race and racism in all forms of government. So while he initially targeted federal contracting and federal employees, his intent was clearly to arm his tens of millions of supporters with fodder to challenge any and all public discussions of race as a social force. And for the most part, he has been quite successful. So much of this anti-CRT activity is centered in the public schools, with districts throughout the country instituting their own anti-CRT policies. So many parrot the executive order's language about divisive concepts and racial scapegoating, while also claiming, quite falsely, that CRT, this complex intellectual framework, is being taught to school children as young as in the elementary years. So even if it was, and to be sure it absolutely is not, anti-CRT activists often distort what CRT really is, declaring that it's about hating white people, sowing division, and anti-Americanism, instead of a systemic approach to understanding the endurance of racial subordination. So what I think is remarkable a bit about what's happening at the local education level is that sometimes this anti-CRT sentiment is not being imposed from the top down, but often from the bottom up. Of course, with much encouragement from those at the top. So parents and other community members are using their status as parents and taxpayers to push school boards to enact these anti-CRT policies and resolutions. They're overwhelming school board meetings. We've seen the videos online. Sometimes they are resorting to violence. And now they're running conservative slates of school board candidates, often in places that have not seen a competitive race for the school board in years. So of course, this is dangerous for its practical consequences of whitewashing history and limiting children's exposure to important topics. And of course, it is maligning a rich intellectual tradition. But it's also dangerous because it feeds into this notion that education is less of a social public good, but rather has these defining aspects of property. So in previous work, I've looked at and argued that school district officials often feel great pressure to bend to the will of parents, community members, and taxpayers, because the way we've set up education, kind of the educational apparatus in the United States, really encourages a fiduciary-like role for school administration to protect the investment that local taxpayers and parents have made into that community's education. So as a result, school administrators see themselves not as educational professionals and experts, but merely as agents to parents and other community principals. So I'm an assistant professor at UCLA, where we have the Critical Race Studies program. And one of the things we're working on right now is to compile and track this local activity to really provide a rich data set of anti-CRT school activity that's really sweeping the nation. So we have a lot of RAs working on this. And right now, as my latest count, we've identified anti-CRT local activity in at least 24 states and counting. As I've shifted through this activity, many of the media accounts are pointing to school boards acting because of complaints and pressures by parents and community members. School board members often have no educational experience, surprisingly, and that makes them easy targets for unhappy parents and community members. And what's especially important is that in some of these districts, administrators who were otherwise promoting inclusive practices are being stymied by their school boards. Let me give a couple examples. So in June of this year, the Douglas County, Colorado School District pressured the superintendent and several principals to cancel upcoming anti-racist staff training and to publicly declare that it would not teach CRT in its schools. Now, this is interesting because this was a district who, prior to this activity, was implementing an equity policy, which included this canceled training. It's also a district that was paying the Anti-Defamation League to use its No Place for Hate anti-racism curriculum, which is now in flux as to its implementation. Another example comes in Cherokee County, Georgia, where parent protesters against CRT pressured the school board to halt what they were going to do as far as equity, diversity, and inclusion, which had included hiring an administrator to oversee the implementation of the plan. Parents demanded that if an offer had already gone out to bring this person into the school district, that the offer be rescinded. And as a final example, in New York State, a superintendent was fired by the School Board of Education after parents expressed their anger over his plan to create a diversity task force, which they falsely deemed to be implementing CRT into classrooms. This superintendent also planned to use the ADL's No Place for Hate curriculum to discuss systemic racism and promote anti-bias in the schools. Parents at the school board meeting actually cheered his firing when the firing was announced. So what these examples show, I think, is the way in which parents and community members use their status as parents and taxpayers to argue that their views on education should carry the day, and that administrators have an obligation to protect parents' visions of what school is and should be, regardless of their pedagogical soundness. Under this view, education belongs to parents and the community. And because education belongs to them, they are entitled to have their wishes granted, even when those wishes go against the pedagogical decisions of those who are actually experts in education. So parents are using education as property when they insist that their status as parents, as community members, and especially as taxpayers gives them the power and the control and allows them to really weaponize their ownership status, ownership of their homes, ownership of their children, and ultimately ownership of their schools. It's really important to understand that this backlash against CRT being rooted in public schools is completely predictable. Going back to what Professor Rana said. So broader conversations and controversies about race and racism have always found a home in our system of public education. So we see this in Brown versus Board of Education. We see this in Milliken v. Bradley. We even see this in Parents Involved up in Seattle. The way we do education, which is a huge focus of my work, through looking at residency requirements, property tax funding, and this nebulous idea of local control, really encourages parents, community members, and taxpayers to see so-called public education as a property entitlement and thus a valuable resource that's totally under their control. And as a result, the political pressures combined with the economic resources of a community to have the effect of subordination by refusing to even discuss the inequities and stratifications that are so evident in our society. And another important thing I want to note is that while there is thinking about this in a partisan manner, I think is very important, but many of these things are happening in places where we would not expect them to actually happen. And another thing is that they're happening sometimes in these very diverse communities. So if that's the case, and anti-CRT is being used as this weapon to get rid of all diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, it's really also subordinating Black, Brown, Asian, Native American children and families within those school districts as well. So I'm going to stop there, and I really look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baldwin-Clark. I think this crossover between public law and private law themes is something that we definitely like to see in the LPE network, as well as your general presentation. Okay, next we're on to Diana Reddy. Diana.
Hey everyone, thanks. Thanks to everyone for being here and for all for the LPE project for being this incredible organizing force, and to all of the other panelists. This is such an important conversation. So I want to connect the discussion we've been having so far to current conflicts within law and political economy. And I want to suggest that in many ways, public education is the quintessential topic of law and political economy. This is because in terms of law, as legal scholar Justin Driver recently wrote, public education has often been, I think he put it, the preeminent site of constitutional law, the place in the area in which many of the most important battles about constitutional rights have been fought. And there's a reason for that, which is that public education is one of the few things that the government does, that is kind of one of the core sites of the public within American law and political economy, in which the public in so many ways has been eviscerated. And so on the one hand, if legal scholars say public education is the preeminent site of American constitutional law, what venture capitalists and investment firms say is that public education is the most undercapitalized sector of the United States economy. And if you go to the websites of various different investment banking groups, venture capitalists, that is how education as a sector is discussed, particularly K through 12. It's an outlier, they say, in market capitalization. Which means that for all the resources that are put into it, there's not much profit being made. And so I want to talk about how the organizing by the right, and in particular by longstanding powerful organizations in the realm of education policy, but not just education policy, how this kind of manufactured crisis over critical race theory fits into a longer term agenda that is about restructuring public education as we know it. So if we want to look at the organizations on the right that are making the most of the critical race theory backlash, we see a lot of organizations whose primary commitment is to, as they put it, free market values. So Christopher Rufo, who is identified as the semi-pundit who kind of was the progenitor of the recent backlash against critical race theory, in which he acknowledges was something that he essentially, invented out of nothing, which is not to say that he doesn't believe that it is a problem, but that in terms of the timing in which this emerged, that was something that he that was his action. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, which is a leading free market think tank focused on issues like education. And if you look at the websites of organizations like the Manhattan Institute, when you look at what they have to say, they now have an entire section that's dedicated to critical race theory and the problems with it. But when you look at their education issue advocacy, it is almost entirely focused on the question of choice. And most recently, another fellow at the Manhattan Institute published an op-ed in the Washington Post entitled "Republicans Could Take Democrats to School." And it says, critical race theory and COVID restrictions have turned education into a wedge issue for voters, which is accurate. And it goes on to say, parents are wising up to the damage that union control of public education has wrought, and Republicans ought to embrace the opportunity to explain to voters why the best response to everything from racial propaganda and incompetent education bureaucrats to mask mandates and learning gaps is more school choice. So on the right, these organizations who've been in this business for a very long time are very clear about what the stakes of this current issue are, that this is an opportunity to both change political control in this contentious moment, and also to advance a longstanding goal of school choice. And what I want to point out is that these organizations use race both in order to appeal, to advance this agenda, both in order to appeal to, again, the reactionary white suburban parents, but also they at least claim to speak for the needs of the disenfranchised, low income, poor Black and brown parents. And so if we look at a recent, again, Christopher Rufo article trying to talk about the problems with public schools, he concludes, one teacher at William Kelly who requested anonymity out of fear of reprisals expressed deep pessimism about the future of public education. I've come to realize that no policy hurts African Americans more than the public school system and the teachers union. He said, and then Christopher Rufo goes on, the teacher is right. In absolute terms, the numbers are demoralizing. The school district of Philadelphia has 18,000 employees and a 3.4 billion annual budget and fails year after year to teach the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. So here we see these organizations using race in two different and very deliberate ways, but with the same argument that we need to opt out of the public, and we need more choice, and that choice will allow white parents to avoid the racial propaganda that makes makes white children feel guilty for being white, but also poor Black and brown parents who want the best for their kids need to opt out of public education because it is inherently discriminatory, and market choice is inherently liberatory. And that's where I really want to focus, because one of the things that is so concerning to me about this ongoing strain of argument is that, like all effective rhetorical tools, it builds on realities, right? Particularly when we're talking about the failures of public education. There's no question that public education has, as Aziz pointed out, a complicated history like every American institution. And that, in fact, it is a facilitator of important of social stratification in problematic ways that we can identify. But I think the important thing here is to note that within contemporary politics, the position, the way that the options are staked out is often you can have the public and here are the problems with it, and then the solution is the private. The solution is opting out of the public entirely, as opposed to reforming the public. And that's a false dichotomy, right? That either we have the public with the problems that it's had, or the only solution is opting out. And so I really want to emphasize that, again, this is all taking place within a context in which people are opting out of public education. So the hysteria about CRT follows in the wake of the COVID crisis, the ongoing COVID crisis. And if you look at the numbers, folks who have, the number of homeschoolers has doubled during the years of the pandemic. Virtual charters and other forms of charter schools, their enrollments are significantly up. There's a huge decrease in public school enrollment in many places, particularly here in California, where I am. And I think many folks are saying this is temporary, as a result of the pandemic. But I think there are many people, again, these organizations, I think, are quite invested in making sure that it's not temporary, that this moment, these social crises are an opportunity to fundamentally restructure education to increase its market capitalization. And so I want to note that in some of the places like Oklahoma, where there is, which passed an incredibly restrictive and punitive anti-CRT provision, is also a location, I think the leading location in which students have left public education for virtual charters. The numbers are honestly staggering. And so these two things really do go hand in hand. So the provision passed by the Oklahoma Board of Education provided for teacher suspensions and district defunding for instruction that makes any individual feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. At the same time, according to numbers that I saw, charter enrollment in Oklahoma increased by 78% over the past year. And so I just want to conclude by saying that there's a number of reasons why I think that the idea that opting out of the public as the solution to stratification, and this is for folks on the left, it is a problem. And I think folks who do more work in the education policy realm can talk more about the consequences for those specific for the most disenfranchised students of opting out of public systems, as opposed to reforming them. But I also want to talk, and conclude with, as this fight about education is also a fight about public employment. And I worry sometimes that in talking about public education, even progressives, those who are left of center, kind of fall into, honestly, what can be a neoliberal trope of education is the primary vector of ending social stratification. It is the only tool of advancement, and I think that is empirically incorrect, and also not the origin of public education. And so again, I want to talk, the public education, and particularly K through 12 educators, are the most highly unionized sector of the United States economy. So it's not just the least market capitalized, it is also the most union dense. And of course, labor unions are major players in contemporary politics, not as much as they once used to be, but significant supportors of democratic candidates and many important policies. And I think of some of these school choice options, for instance, charters. Charters are the gig economy of education, in that they do the same thing but without the regulations. And as a result of that, charter schools, only 11% of charter schools are unionized. And so when we're talking about this attack on public education, it is also attack on jobs, and on good quality jobs, and on the important reality that one of the most important, if we're talking about social stratification and upward mobility, good quality jobs have always been essential to that. And so I think it's really important that we make sure that that is part of this conversation. And I'll stop there. Sorry for going over.
No problem. Rich content. Thank you very much, Diana. Dr. Singh, I think that you have some comments and perhaps some comments to interweave with some points that folks just raised.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this really important event. And those were wonderful presentations. And I'm going to kind of take my prerogative as the last speaker to maybe offer some thoughts, but also some questions that kind of ran through my mind while I was listening to everybody. And I do have a couple of things to say independent of the presentation. So first, I think one of the things that's important to realize about, CRT, critical race theory, is that it's a floating signifier now, right? It's what it's meant to do the work of tying together a range of disparate things that are that its opponents are trying to associate as noxious or authoritarian or whatever they want to sort of do. So Rufo, who was mentioned by Diana, put it this way. He said, we're trying to freeze their brand, critical race theory, and turn it toxic by associating what he calls various cultural insanities under this rubric, right? So there's a lot that's kind of being lumped within the sort of framework that is called CRT: diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism training. In New York City, it's a contest around whether getting rid of gifted and talented programs in the name of racial equity is an advance or a regression. I mean, there's all kinds of variations in the way in which this floating signifier works. I think one of the things that the presentations help us to understand is that these attacks do exist within a longer history, right? That Aziz Rana laid out, in which moral panics around race become the mechanism for mobilizing certain aspects of the polity or certain constituencies within the polity, right, towards certain kinds of projects. My question for Aziz, in part, though, is how continuous or disjunctive do we think of the contemporary politics of white supremacy being with that of the past? And I guess by that question, I'm trying to point to the possibility that the terrain on which these conflicts are now unfolding is quite different than it was in the sort of high era of white supremacy. And I think that this is something that we actually do need to attend to. In some ways, I think we could say that the use of racialized politics as a wedge issue has been part of the American political sort of project since the civil rights era, or maybe before the civil rights era. In 1948, I think it was Henry Moon of the NAACP who called racial politics the balance of power, right? And Moon was thinking about the mobilization of Black voters for the Democratic Party. But if we think of race politics within a kind of regime of bipartisanship, in which neither the mobilization of kind of racist investments or anti-racist investments ultimately change systemic prerogatives, but instead serve as kind of leading edges or wedges for defining coalitional identities, whose center of gravity remains more tied to regional and economic interests than it does fundamentally to the enforcement of white supremacy or to the achievement of racial justice. What I mean to say by that really is that both parties in some ways operate within kind of dynamics of opportunistic politicization. around issues of race. You know, and I think in some ways, Diana's presentation really points to that in the way in which even the anti-CRT folks, who are clearly trying to mobilize kind of white precarity in the name of a kind of an attack on whiteness itself, you know, also sort of turn around and give the other face to, say, poor Black and brown parents and say, we're also trying to save you from neglect in the public schools. And then even in the Oklahoma statute that you read, Diana, I mean, the language protecting any individual from trauma associated with race or sexual identity, I mean, it could be indistinguishable almost from the language of a certain kind of gender sensitivity or anti-racism training itself, right? Except that it's being mobilized in a very particular way. So I think there's some ways in which we're in a kind of confusing environment in terms of trying to assess really what the balance of forces are and what these kinds of initiatives actually mean. You know, and so my question for Professor Baldwin Clark really kind of revolves around, I think, the very interesting presentation you gave and sort of digging deeper into the research you're doing. And I know it's sort of at an early stage, but one of the things I'm really curious about is how are these initiatives playing out in different communities? In other words, are they playing out differently in communities that are racially and ethnically heterogeneous versus those that are racially and ethnically homogeneous? How do we assess these initiatives as sort of grassroots, sort of parentally driven initiatives, and how do we assess them as kind of astroturfed politics? Because my sense is in some ways that these are ginned up by media manipulation. They are seen by the kind of political operatives in the kind of partisan realm, almost exclusively in relationship to the election of 2022 and 2024, which is they're thinking about how these can be used to get people interested and get them to vote within the sort of framework of kind of partisan struggle. And they are likely, kind of like the attacks on Sharia law or other things that we've seen in the past, to sort of fade as they become less useful. And so that's where I'm also kind of wondering about the sort of durability of these initiatives. In other words, or the way in which this is not your kind of our grandfather's white supremacy, right? This is a kind of moment in which the opportunistic politicization of kind of racial antagonism through partisan politics is being used for a whole variety of different kinds of ends that aren't always that easy to sort out. And this kind of leads me to the sort of the last point I would make that relates back again to Diana's presentation, you know, that the privatization of public education, or the opportunity that is seen by venture capitalists and kind of other interests in capitalizing this arena. Clearly, we know this is the sort of the last frontier of neoliberalism in some ways, capturing the public schools, capturing the public dollars that go into public schools. And of course, in New York City, this has almost exclusively been framed in terms of not anti-CRT, but in terms of serving disadvantaged communities, right? So in terms of the politics of public education, we're dealing with this kind of tricky terrain. So when I look at this from within a very wealthy public school district in Manhattan where my kids go, I mean, their schools are, you know, I mean, hyper woke, let's just say, right? And they are also predominantly white and Asian. And they're making some efforts to diversify their staff, and they do all the trainings and they do all the right things. And I do not use wokeness as a pejorative. So I'm not thinking of it that way. I'm perfectly happy for my kids to be learning what they're learning in those schools. But there's a huge disjuncture nonetheless, because then when the conversation turns to ending gifted and talented programs, and it turns to ending specialized high schools, all the students in my kids' school start talking about, when are we going to pull our kids out and put them in private schools? So if we're going to sort of seriously think about the class politics of this, as well as the race politics of this, I think we have to realize that we're kind of operating within a very contradictory kind of terrain, in which a lot of stuff is still in formation. And I struggle myself to really figure out clearly how to navigate it, right? And I worry about kind of the elite skew of a certain kind of professional anti-racism. And of course, I worry about the mobilization of kind of white revanchist politics. And let's face it, I mean, the really conscious conservatives, the Claremont Institute types, I mean, they see all of this in terms of basically rolling back the Civil Rights Act. I mean, that's the horizon that interests them. But right now, all of them still have to accommodate to the fact of a kind of a baseline, an American Universalist baseline, as Aziz put it, but an American Universalist baseline that was actually reshaped by the Civil Rights Movement. So it's an American Universalist baseline that isn't, as much as you want to tie it to ethnocultural nationalism, that's also potentially a losing proposition for the right. The right is always, I think, having to figure out, and I think this is the problem Trump posed for them. Trump on the one hand, was able to gin up a certain kind of right-wing politics around a more overtly revanchist racism, but it also poses a problem because it engenders a kind of another kind of political opportunity on the left of center, right? And so I guess I know those comments aren't entirely clear. They're more reflections and thoughts that I'm sort of working through. But I think in those there was a question for each of you if you wanted to take them up. And I know the audience is going to have questions. And I really appreciate the conversation, and I hope that's at least somewhat helpful in posing some problems for us as we kind of think of this going forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. I think those reflections help set up our crosstalk and Q&A quite nicely. I'll try to repose some of them. So there was a question at the beginning for you, Dr. Rana, as to what is disjunctive between this episode of the backlash against CRT versus what Dr. Singh called your grandfather's white supremacy. I'm wondering if you could comment on that, and I'm particularly interested to know if you have points about the vision of a market that is entailed here and its universalizing appeal. It seems that's very present in today's iteration of the assault on public education, but it has different contours in the times of the KKK and the Press Bureau, for instance.
Yeah, so two thoughts in a way, connecting what you just said to Diana's presentation and Nikhil's question, that I think one of the things that's really significant is the way in which these kinds of initiatives in their long history, again, going back a century, fuse elements of the right that we might think don't necessarily have to fit together. So like, on the one hand, you have social and racial conservatism. On the other hand, you have a kind of market fundamentalism. There's no reason why you should assume that these two things are linked. And I think a real power of the focus on public schooling, this is Diana's point, is that they essentially create a coherent ideological framework among constituencies that are not necessarily ideological allies, that in fact, in different iterations could be, opposed or strange bedfellows. And one of the reasons why I think that there's this kind of recourse to debates around schooling across, from the 20s to the present, is how it's a mode, it's an opportunity to actually engage in a kind of shared political practice that further reasserts the fact that these two things should naturally fit together. So you can tell a story that goes from the 20s to the present that links together, 1950s anti-communism politics that also is around local schooling, who's teaching in the schools, that connects the John Birchers to sort of various elements of the business right. To then we could be talking in the 1980s and the 1990s, for example, about the fears around Spanish instruction in schools in California, which has a very similar kind of coalitional framework that ends up building, to, for example, conversations about LGBTQ rights and the extent to which you have teaching around LGBTQ identity in various schools that we start seeing debates around in the 80s, 90s, 2000s as well, to, for example, the conversations now about CRT. And so that there's a constant sort of iterative return to this as a site that fuses together components of a larger coalitional framework that ideologically might not actually necessarily fit together. And this kind of connects to Nikhil's point, which is the reason why I gave the genealogy that focuses on the North and the West and on bills, that if you look at the Constitution instruction bills in the 20s, they look like this. Like they're in universal terms. They don't seem like bills that necessarily have an ideological agenda that you'd associate with white racial reaction. Is that I think this is a very different genealogy than the more familiar one that actually focuses on what we think of as traditional white supremacy. So Southern segregation, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, that is explicitly grounded in hierarchy. These are ideas that start to really percolate in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then especially against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, become, I think, the common way that white racial reactionary politics responds to the kind of pervasive mainstreaming of an anti-discrimination discourse. And the way that you have the response articulated is through a language of colorblindness and through a language of sort of faith in the exceptionalism of the American project. But it's this combination of faith in the exceptionalism of the American project with this language of universalism that provides a kind of flexible ideological space to articulate kind of fairly sort of long-standing versions of racial reaction and traditionalism. So I think it's absolutely the case that what we're dealing with at present is not the same as, conversations about, let's say, 19th century sort of settler colonialism or the high tide of the Jim Crow South, that it's its own contemporary variation, but it's a variation that nonetheless has a genealogy and it has real deep roots. And those deep roots, I think, are really significant because it highlights why it's such a comfortable and continuous way of talking about racial reaction. So that would just be the thought.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rana. I think that's a helpful response here. Diana, Dr. Rana, touched upon a few themes that I think you expressed as well. I'm wondering how you see these new sort of universalized yet racialized politics of choice playing out now in a way that it might be different from previous episodes in history.
I think it's a great question, and what I most related to in Nikhil's presentation was that this is a really unstable moment, and I think it's in some ways really difficult to analyze it as we go along, because I think it is a moment, and it has been since maybe like certainly the 2016 election of realignments. And the ways in which, both discourse and kind of groupings are the shifting is changing. And, I definitely remember in the midst of all the COVID, in the midst of kind of the discussion of how COVID was impacting public schools. And there was this article that a lot of my friends, who are, again, on the left, were sharing about the inherent racism of public schools. And I forget, it had some brilliant clickbait title. And it identified, it named empirically correct facts about some of the traumas of public education for groups who don't get to go to the great schools that many of us got to go to. But when you look to see who the author was, it was, someone who, I think was ostensibly a Democrat, but was very much about, we need charters, we need to eviscerate traditional public education. And, I think some of that is still up for grabs. I mean, these questions about where like charters, in fact, in terms of like their racial impact, that is something that is still being hotly debated, including by those who are left of center. And I mean, I think this is part of a broader project of, what is the relationship between capitalism and racial equity? And that's something that, Milton Friedman took on squarely in his treatise, right? Capitalism and Freedom has a whole chapter about how free market, advances racial equality. It has helped, remediate the status inequalities that come from any other attempt at organizing society. Right. And so it is we are in the midst of this. Like, is any attempt at a majoritarian political system inherently going to have discriminatory racial impacts that we find unacceptable today? So I think this is a great question. I don't think any of us have the answers right now, but it feels incredibly important. And I will say that to the extent on the right, we are seeing the solidifying of the free market right, the market fundamentalists with the white reactionaries, with the Christian conservatives, then, what we need on the left is the solidifying of, political allegiances between, as I write in some of my stuff, the kind of New Deal vision of the left with the rights revolutions vision of the left. And I think that's what we're trying to figure out. Like, how does a belief in a really regulated economy with a really important social safety net, how do we better explain that is also a movement for empowerment of women, of people of color, and so forth.
Thank you very much for that response, Anna. Dr. Baldwin-Clark, you're welcome to respond to the last two comments. That being said, Dr. Singh did pose a question or series of questions for you around what is different this time around. There seemed to be a suggestion that a lot of what is going on is astroturfing and political theater. And your presentation, I believe, suggested that much of this energy is coming from parents and taxpayers and homeowners who identify as such. So I'm wondering if you have any further thoughts on this.
So I think, again, it's a great question about how are these initiatives really playing out in different areas of, are there demographic differences, all of that. So I'll admit that at this point, we don't necessarily have all of that data. It's in a kind of our next iteration. But what I would say is that the example that you give about kind of woke white parents who say they love diversity, say they love inclusion, but as soon as we get practices that are about inclusion, that are about getting rid of exclusion, people then change their minds, right? And so what I think is happening is in many of these places, this is about people kind of changing their minds. They thought it was great to have, some of this diversity. They want their kids to go to school in diverse areas, but they don't want their teachers to be actually talking about race, right? And then as soon as they start talking about race, it's kind of like, oh, now this is bad for my children and I don't want it anymore. I actually think what's really interesting about this too, I was really appealed by this idea that Dr. Rana talked about, where there's this kind of warped sense of interest conversion going on, right? And the warpedness of it, there is a great video out there of a Black man, and he is in a school board meeting, and he gets up and he says, I don't want CRT taught in our schools either, because it teaches Black children that they're always being oppressed. But I work with Black children in these communities, and I don't want them to ever hear that type of language, that there is something that they cannot overcome. And when I say that there's this interest conversion, then, right, this is the idea that, oh, we also can, convince Black and brown parents that you don't want CRT either, because CRT is teaching your children that they're oppressed. It's teaching your children that they cannot, make it. They can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So I'm really, really interested in that question. I hadn't heard it really put together in that way, but I do think that that's something that's happening in that space that definitely needs to be looked at. My work really points out, and I'm also very involved in school districts in which my children have been in, is that the loudest voices generally take the day, right? And so this happens everywhere, but this especially happens with parents and schools, because those who are loudest, which are those who typically have all of the capital that they need, right? So these are the people who have the social capital to know, okay, I'm going to, say something to the school board member. They have the cultural capital. They know what the school board idea is. How do things happen in this space? And of course, they have the economic capital, which allows them to say, we are taxpayers. These are our homes. These are our children. And they're able to really mobilize all of these resources that actually arise from the fact that they have economic and class privileges to then go into schools and go into school boards and make it their vision that they want to see for their children. And so again, to wrap up, I do think it's a really interesting question about how is this playing out with different demographic groups. But I will say, one of the things that we're finding, as I said before, is that this is happening in school districts all over the country. And what we see right now is that it's actually hard to figure out, is this necessarily something that could be broken down easily among partisan lines. Part of it is because of the interest conversion. Part of it is because, parents act crazy when it comes to their children, and they say that they want good things for all children, but when it comes down to it, they're really more concerned about their own children and their own children's needs and their own children's ideals of what they have for them. I think parenting in school, obviously from the work I do, is a really fascinating thing to kind of look at, especially in public schools.
Great. Thank you very much for that response, Dr. Baldwin-Clark. So all four of you, I think, have highlighted that forces on the right, or perhaps forces in the center, or just dominant forces in society in general, are trying to inculcate a certain vision of work, a certain vision of a worker, a certain vision of family, a certain vision of household via public education. And we understand that deviance and theft, as you point out, Dr. Baldwin-Clark, is punished. And we have a question here from the chat about what does enforcement, punishment, discipline actually look like? Dr. Baldwin-Clark, I welcome your comments on that. Dr. Singh, I know you also do work around prisons, so I'm wondering if you would also like to add a carceral or an anti-carceral lens to this.
Oh, you're muted.
You're on mute, Dr. Singh.
I'm going to say something really brief, and I'm very, very, very sorry that I have to leave. I had mentioned that I had another meeting butting up against this that was scheduled at the last minute. This was amazing, and I appreciate everybody kind of responding to my ill-formed questions. I think instead of answering your question, I'm going to just pose another question, which is, I do think, we've lived through the greatest period of racial justice protests in our lifetimes with the George Floyd rebellions this summer, and the upsurge of interest across as many communities as we see. I mean, probably way more communities than we've seen CRT protests occur. So how do we make sense of the kind of viral nature of the Floyd protests against the viral nature of the CRT protests? Where do they sit in a kind of our understanding of sort of of democratic discourse and struggle in this moment around questions of race? I really wonder about that, and sort of one of my questions sort of back to the panel, and this sort of relates to my original point about, I take the argument very, very seriously, and I agree with Aziz Rana's kind of giving us this genealogy of kind of colorblind American universalism. I think the right wants to get back to that actually after Trump, maybe in a more offensive way, and it will mutate in its own ways as well now. But I also still think that they're now contending against a much more difficult set of forces, and so the right is not hegemonic, right? We shouldn't overestimate the cohesiveness of the right in this moment. I think this goes to Diana Reddy's point about the difficulties of and also to Professor Baldwin's point about the interest convergence and the ways this is scrambling some alignments. So I think it's like the beginning of a really important conversation. And so I haven't specifically commented on the criminal justice reform piece. I think it still has tremendous energy behind it. It's always, to me, a subtext in every conversation about race, sometimes an overt text, but oftentimes a subtext. But how we fit these things together, I think, is an important question. So I'm going to have to leave it at that. I'm so sorry. Thank you all, and see you next time.
Dr. Singh had to leave a bit early, but we thank him for his comments. Dr. Baldwin-Clark, did you have a follow-up to it?
Yeah, for sure. So you asked about the question of enforcement, and I think it's really important. So some of the examples that I gave, the enforcement is we're going to fire the superintendent. So there are definitely some actual enforcement happening as far as direct enforcement. But what I think is important is that one of the things that we're seeing is that you don't need direct enforcement for this all to happen. On the one hand, there are some ideological issues. So if a parent then says they complain about a teacher in a school, it's not necessarily an enforcement that's happening, but it could be that the principal goes and talks to that teacher and says, hey, you might want to make different pedagogical decisions here. One of the things, like you said, that I find in my work is that sometimes there is absolutely criminal enforcement of things like what I call stealing education that happens. But I really kind of think that the threat is really important. And not only that, I think that, I can't remember who brought it up, but how CRT is being, I think it said the floating signifier, which I love that term, the floating signifier for anything that has to do with race and racism. And so it's not even in these cases, there are some school districts who have no CRT backlash, but there is interest in where they're saying, okay, maybe we can't do this diversity, inclusion, and equity work anymore, because we're afraid that there's going to be then a backlash. We're afraid that then parents are going to say, oh, no, we thought you weren't doing that here. Oh, you're doing that here. We need to get rid of, we need to push back about that now. And that's kind of, those questions are actually hard to get at, right? Because that's not showing up in the news reports. That's not showing up on YouTube with parents complaining at school board meetings. And so I think it's really important that these anti-CRT bills actually have a much wider breadth than I think that we can kind of understand at this moment, because it's this idea, as I put it, that parents are better pedagogical experts than are experts in education. And as long as that is the case, you're always going to have, these individual parents who are going to have some amount of power, who will then really thwart things and put the entire school or district in a trajectory that is away from diversity, equity, inclusion, and towards more thinking about conservatism within the public school.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baldwin-Clark. So we are pressing up against time, but given the quality of the conversation, I would like to ask just one question for final thoughts, and that's about resistance. You all have highlighted the ways in which this framework, especially the funding framework, sets it up such that people are constantly at each other's throats, different classes of people in different ways. People may even feel, one way as a parent, one way as a taxpayer, one way as a worker, et cetera, et cetera. So given the complexity of the legal design involved, how do you all briefly envision resistance, beginning with you, Dr. Rana?
So, I should say that I probably don't have, a knockdown solution to this that, I feel like I probably wouldn't be situated at a university if I had a better sense of some of like the conditions by which we could engage in the transformational politics. But I'll say a couple things. So the first thing, I think it actually is important to underscore an argument that Nikhil made, which is, one thing that is, I think, profoundly different than iterations of this kind of politics that we saw, let's say, in the 1970s and the 1980s, is that we're at a moment historically where we're seeing the decline of what had been the Reagan Republican coalition. And that actually is a very different kind of structural force that shapes the terms of these conversations. So it is simply the case that, 40, 50 years ago, the right was ascendant, that you could have a situation where somebody like Ronald Reagan could be an incredibly popular politician in the most populous state in the union and then win landslide elections. And I think everything that we've seen basically at the national level, really over the last decade plus, is the fact that that right-wing coalition is it's consolidated, but it's a declining coalition. And that part of what's going on here is that, in a way, because of the nature of federalism, because of the structure of being able to assert power at the state and local level, that even though this is a declining coalition, it can still sort of assert a huge amount of power, indeed more power necessarily than the actual numerical support, through these kinds of instruments, which is another reason why state politics and then local debates, for example, around public schools become such a kind of galvanizing space for articulating right-wing politics, because it's changing the terrain so that you can actually win battles when in truth you can't really win the same battles at the national level. Now, that's not necessarily a recipe for like absolute optimism, because it tells us something about maybe the profoundly dysfunctional nature of American institutions and how that plays out across a variety of different issues, that you can have coalitions that are declining that can assert increasingly more aggressive and extreme versions of their politics and be able to find spaces to build mass support. But it also means that I think it is important to recognize that the headwinds are really pressing back against the kind of right-wing politics, and that the right-wing politics is engaged in a type of attempt to sort of reboot efforts from the past to see if you can get the same kind of positives in the present. So, with that as a background, like the thing that I would say is, as Diana suggested, it means really investing in, to me, what is the actual promise of transformative change in the US, which is building a class-conscious, multiracial coalition across a variety of different institutional spaces. So in labor, in party politics, and in a variety of, through movements like the movement for Black Lives. And that actually schools are a really powerful space for making these arguments, precisely because actually the power of teachers' unions and the ways in which teacher labor activism has been one of the significant forces in the resurgence of labor politics and strike politics over the last decade. And so I think investing in the spaces that are the kind of institutional foundations for the emergent left formation is really the best ultimate solution to the kind of counter mobilization that you're getting on the right, with a background recognition that there are these massive structural impediments for truly transformative change in the US. But we're at this really dramatic historical moment where the right coalition is genuinely slipping, and that in fact the space for left arguments across a variety of different topics is probably more expansive now than really at any point in my life.
Got it. Thank you. Diana, additional notes on resistance, especially given the mention of teachers unions?
Absolutely. It's a wonderful question to end on. So one of the things that I found most interesting about what's happening with groups on the right or on the center, because I guess, the world in which I live in is not a target. I am not a target for the organizing by the Manhattan Institute, but myself and my communities are targets for organizing by groups like the National Parents Union, which is one of the organizations that uses very much the language of racial equity, but to advance a free market choice vision for education reform. They're organizing. As someone who has a child in public school, like during the pandemic, when there were the concerns about schools reopening and the role of teachers unions in facilitating or obstructing that, there were parents there who were, kind of, as LaToya was talking about, right? There's this really interesting nexus between, parents who are essentially, radicalized through their experience of, being a parent for the first time, or having in this moment of multiple social crises, having to think about how do I advocate for my child, and then being given tools by organizations that say, here's how you do it. And then they say yes, and then there's organizing on the ground, and what that, so that's troubling to see, but it's also a reminder organizing works. Organizing is an incredibly powerful force, and it's served both by having kind of these like larger institutional narratives and discourses and toolkits, but also the like interpersonal connections that we all use to make sense of what's happening to us in the world. And so, I recently wrote a piece for the Law and Political Economy blog about bargaining for the common good. And bargaining for the common good is, I think, one of the ways in which we are trying to build this left coalition. And in that article, I wrote about my concern about how the language is used. I worry that too often bargaining for the common good is used to mean teachers' unions should sacrifice worker interests for the benefit of student interests or other interests of the folks that they are served. And I think it's misused in that way. I think the most radical transformative ways in which bargaining for the common good happens on the ground is teachers' unions working in communities, working with community groups in which there's overlapping identities, right? Where we recognize that teachers are parents, are community members, are taxpayers, and trying to come up with this more comprehensive vision of what institutional change looks like that takes seriously public employment and workers' rights and student rights and the needs of communities of color. And so that's what I'm excited about. And I guess my brief caution though is to watch out for like flashy websites and like, shiny rhetoric, because in this moment, there's a lot of, there's people want to change. And the well-funded folks have the better websites. But I think we have, what we've always had, which is people power. And that's what I'm excited about. Thank you.
And I'll just briefly say that I absolutely 100% agree with that. I think that what is happening and what needs to happen is organizing on the ground. And so, just personally, I do a lot of that work in my children's school districts because for example, when our school superintendent, he was the first one in California to mandate vaccination for all children who were able to do so. And there was a huge pushback from this very vocal group of parents. But what we had to do is we organized a group that also went to the school district that also said, no, we like what our superintendent is doing. And, in a way, it's good for us because we were able to do it, but we drowned out the people who were against it. And we organized against people who were like, I'm not sure. But then we had a bigger conversation. Okay, what does this mean so that our children can continue to go to school, right? And we've been doing that on a local level about issues of equity and diversity. We've organized in order to make sure that we get an assistant superintendent of DEI. We're organizing so that we can talk directly to our superintendent without going to the school board, because we generally think that they're so ineffective. They're not doing what it is that we need to be done. And I think that, all of my work is about things happening at the local level. I 100% believe that we have to be looking locally. And I think what Professor Rana said, that you can make so much change at the local level that you could never really make at the state level or at the federal level. But that's where, quote unquote, the indoctrination is happening. And so that's where we need to be focusing our time. And lastly, I think Diana is so correct. Many of the coalitions that we're making are not just parents. We are bringing in like-minded teachers who have that ability to then also be very, very effective in using their organization, using their union power to also push for many of the reforms that we're looking at. But it requires this coalition of different people who actually, though, have very similar interests in what it is that we're trying to do. Teachers want to work in diverse schools too, right? Teachers want to work in places that are anti-racist. And so we're bringing in these different strands of constituencies and making the change coming from that place at the local level.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Baldwin-Clark. Thanks to all three of you for offering these hopeful notes of resistance or counterpower here at the end. It's nice to end that way. Again, thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks to the audience for joining this edition of LPE Theater. You can come to our next event on Monday, November 8th from 12:15 to 1:30 p.m. ET. It's the first event in a year-long co-sponsored series between the LPE Project and the Global Health Justice Partnership on health, social reproduction, and the crisis of care. That event is entitled Care as Labor, Care as Infrastructure, and will feature Peggy Smith, Gabe Wynand, Hae-Young Yoon, and it will be moderated by our own faculty co-director, Amy Kapczynski. Thanks again. Looking forward to seeing you all next time around.
Thanks so much. Great to be part of this.